I'm Dr. Vanessa Bartlett. I'm a Mackenzie postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne. Before I begin my presentation today, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I live and work on, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm in the first year of a postdoc exploring artist responses to persuasive design. I'm working on a book that combines experimental and participatory audience research with critical and theoretical inquiry to think about the role of art in the attention economy. Today, I'm going to home in specifically on what I call the darkness of persuasive design. So ways that designers deliberately conceal mechanisms of behaviour change within social and commercial interfaces. And I'll be asking if the light of clear vision is deliberately dimmed by forces that shape technology, can digital art practice be a form of illumination? And importantly, I'm going to try and move beyond the simple optics of visibility towards forms of affect. I'm going to argue that this is crucial because persuasive technologies themselves increasingly express agency and influence by manipulating user affect. And the presentation today, as with all of my work, is motivated by a position that visual and digital art is a potent potential space where complex affect can be digested and worked through. The second half of the presentation will apply some of this theoretical thinking to an example of an art practice, an exhibition called Are We All Addicts Now? By artist Catriona Beals. And very briefly, I will introduce the exhibition. I will talk about some of the one particular method that I used to capture some audience responses, and then I'll talk through a set of quotations that came out of this workshop process. And through all of this, I'll try to show how this exhibition provided space for audiences to create their own metaphors, associations, and reflections to describe the affectivity of interfaces. And I'll try and highlight how this is very much facilitated by the role of the artist. I will argue that this creates insight not just into the optics of visibility of persuasive design, but of sensing and affecting in persuasive interfaces as they shape social and commercial lives. So I'll begin by what I'm thinking about as the darkness of persuasive design. So James Bridle's book, New Dark Age, argues that many of the technological systems that we use every day are designed to be deliberately opaque. His central example is the cloud, a physical infrastructure that stores large amounts of personal data, which is often described as if it were weightless, placeless, and intangible. The projected intangibility of the cloud, according to Bridle, renders it less visible and less amenable to critique. So for Bridle, darkness is a metaphor for the deliberate obscuring of the systems of power that design and shape technology. And this results not just in widespread lack of knowledge about how a technology functions, but difficulty in the very act of thinking technology. So he says that we often struggle to conceive of and describe the scope and scale of new technologies, meaning that we have trouble even thinking them. What is needed is not new technology, but new metaphors. So my presentation today attempts to rethink one opaque technology through art practice. So before I go any further, I just want to give a definition of persuasive design and some examples. So persuasive design is a set of design techniques that are embedded in social and commercial interfaces to encourage consumption or increase time on device. Very quickly, some examples. So data capture, often algorithmic, mechanisms covertly designed into websites, enticing consumers into additional spending, Amazon being the classic example. Infinite scroll, operational in a lot of social media, Facebook, Instagram. There are particular capacities in this design which are intended to trigger and stimulate dopamine release in the brain, which is why it's sometimes very difficult to stop scrolling. And dark patterns, Jetstar is a big offender here. So these are interfaces that are designed to confuse users into making a purchase. I fly between Sydney and Melbourne quite often using Jetstar. And when I come to choose my seat, I notice that there are 4 options. The 3 costly options are designed to be really prominent within the interface, and the 1 free option is very small at the bottom. According to persuasive designer Nir Eyal, these devices work with affect that sits just outside user awareness. He argues that persuasive design stimulates feelings that are, quote, below the perceptibility of consciousness. So, reflecting ideas of inscrutability explored in New Dark Age, persuasive design uses opaque, semi-visible techniques to influence affect of which we are only partially conscious as a way of wielding power. So I just want to trip through a couple of pieces of this quotation. So he says that feelings of boredom, loneliness, frustration, confusion, and indecisiveness often instigate a slight pain or irritation and prompt an almost instantaneous and often mindless action to quell the negative sensation. The severity of this discomfort may be relatively minor. Perhaps the fear is below the perceptibility of consciousness, but that is exactly the point. So there's an emphasis on here on changing affective states in order to shape how technology is used. So my current research approaches the darkness or partial visibility of persuasive design through art practice. And in addressing the problem of persuasive design through art, I'm testing the possibility that aesthetic experience offers not just new optics of the interface, but new ways of experiencing its affects. And I'm leaning very much here on a 60-year history of artistic experimentation with computers and the systemic critique that has often underpinned this. So in particular, my research is enabled by work in net art, software art, and interface criticism, which has critiqued the aesthetic neutrality of the interface. So a key text here is the meta interface, where Anderson and Pold characterize the interface with an aesthetic of apparent, quote, smoothness and seamlessness that is designed to allow it to, quote, evade perception. And they suggest that artistic practices help to illuminate what lies beneath the visible interface and to counteract its deliberate attempts to evade our perception. So an example of this kind of work by an artist who is written about in the book, Joanna Moll's work, The Hidden Life of the Amazon User, is going to be one of the case studies for the book that I'm working on. For this project, she bought a copy of The Life Lessons and Rules for Success by Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. And during this process, she was able to capture all of the code that sits behind the interface that we actually see when we engage with Amazon. And she's showing here how much invisible work the interface is doing or making us do to shape our behavior. And the big red lettering there is Joanna Moll's kind of estimations of how many calories we're burning and how much energy we're using as we make our way through this code, which is designed to shape our experience and our behavior. And this is an example of what this work looks like when it's installed in a gallery space. But I'm not only concerned with what art does when it facilitates visibility, seeing interface design to understand how it works, but also with its potential for supporting the difficulty of thinking technology, as Brittle asserts, or specifically art's capacity as an experimental space for reimagining the affective manipulations that shape persuasive platforms. This stance responds to the way that persuasive designers stimulate affects that sit, quote, below the perceptibility of consciousness, as I asserted earlier in the quotations from Nir Eyal. I'm also responding to contemporary art's emerging concern with the affect produced by technology in our so-called post-digital moment. So in their book, Post-Digital Aesthetics, media theorists Berry and Dieter observe that contemporary digital artists are no longer fascinated by functions of technology such as, quote, interactivity, but instead grapple with a, quote, set of affectations that includes unease, fatigue, boredom, and disillusionment. So I won't reread all of this quote, but the emphasis here is this kind of transition in practice from the technical affordances of interactivity towards thinking about our emotional experience in a highly digitized or arguably post-digital age. So I began this presentation by asking if the light of clear vision is deliberately dimmed by forces that shape technology, can digital art practice be a form of illumination? I also asserted the importance of moving beyond the optics of visibility towards new ways of sensing and affectivity that help users think and know the manipulations of persuasive design. To illustrate my argument, I'm going to introduce an exhibition that has profoundly shaped my formulation of these questions. I'll offer several quotes from a workshop with audiences, and I'll argue that these quotes hold an affectivity that demonstrates the audience's thinking and knowing of persuasive design as it is stimulated by the exhibition itself and by the work of the artist as it takes its material form in the exhibition space. So in 2015, UK artist Catriona Beals was awarded a grant by the Wellcome Trust to produce a collection of artworks exploring habit-forming potentials of persuasive design and interfaces. The outcome was an exhibition called Are We All Addicts Now?, which featured glass sculptures containing embedded screens, moving image works, and digitally printed textiles. So here's 3 photographs from the exhibition. You can see there's moving image work. There's also a high concentration on surface and texture, particularly in the form of glass, and glass as it's juxtaposed with some of the more digital elements of the exhibition. So Beals makes moving image and sculptural work that explores the sensual and tactile conditions of life online, the saturated colour and meditative allure of glowing screens. So I was part of the curatorial team, and I was driven by the question, what might an audience's experience of the exhibition illuminate about how they think and know persuasive design, and how might the exhibition be a stimulus for affectively attuning to engagements with interfaces? Now, I'm going to be very brief about method in the context of this presentation. I have written in detail about this method elsewhere. But I'm going to say very briefly, due to time restrictions, that I used a psychosocial research process called the visual matrix, and this was created by a research team at University of Central Lancashire, led by a colleague of mine, Professor Lynn Froggatt. And it's designed to bring forth affect produced in response to aesthetic stimulus. So participants are invited to verbally describe images, emotions, and associations stimulated by the exhibition. So it's very different to conventional audience research. It's not about asking people to analyze their experience of the exhibition. It's trying to access more reflective, unconscious parts of their aesthetic experience. I've started to see this process as one of writing a collaborative text or poem with an audience that describes a collage of words and images and associations that are gathered together from how an audience experiences an exhibition or an artwork. So the remainder of my presentation is going to be about reading some of these quotations from visual matrix workshops conducted on Are We All Addicts Now? And I'm going to just shift my way of speaking into a slightly more kind of poetic and reflective form momentarily, just to kind of make the form of my presentation suited to the nature of the quotations. So everything you see in italic here is a quotation from the audience group. When you bite into a chocolate and the texture is very different inside to how you expected it to be. Like, that's what that sense of having different textures, the glass and the velvet, made me think about. So described here, the surface of a chocolate, perhaps smooth on the outside. Underneath a texture that is unexpected, and how something looked from the outside does not match what's being experienced. And this is expressed in the artwork through the materiality of glass and velvet, as alluded to here by the audience. Another quotation. Particularly that chair is really, really, really soft. This alludes to a chair that Catriona made that was in the exhibition. And I always wanted to stroke it. It reminds me of being a child and wanting to stroke things the wrong way. Sorry, wanting to stroke things as well. But then you stroke it the wrong way. Yes, that too. It's like stroking an animal the wrong way. So described here, a childlike sense of wanting to touch, visual appeal and the anticipation of pleasure. But the smooth, sleek surface might not be as pleasant as it appears. There's a hidden potential for discomfort, an unpleasant reaction from an animal when the pleasure of touch turns sour. It's unsettling again, that feeling in your hands or maybe your whole skin that you've done the wrong thing. I know when someone shaves their head, it's so nice depending on if you go in that direction or the opposite direction. It's a two-way street. So described here is the equal possibility of pleasure or pain depending on the direction of stroking. A pattern is repeating in the audience commentary. Seductive objects that hold pleasurable promise can turn sour and unsettling on contact. So I argue that these metaphors articulate the aesthetic pleasures and pains of interfaces. Surfaces that have the power to make us feel good through the allure of color, connection, and the validation of likes, always possess the potential to turn into something more uncomfortable. Touching, stroking, quote, the wrong way, suggests a feeling that different kinds of interactions with interfaces are produced by the artworks, and that these have very different kinds of affective implications. So for me, this breadth of affect becomes knowable in the space of association and metaphor created by the exhibition. And crucially, this affectivity is embedded in the work itself, sitting within the textural and material choices made by the artist. And this process of translation of affect between artists and audiences is becoming increasingly critical, actually, in all of my work. So the final thing to say is that I think these are unconscious reflections, and they're made with and through the artwork itself, enabled by the research process. And I argue that they offer a way to think and know the affective interfaces through the reflective space offered by the exhibition, and crucially, through that material and affective work that's done by the artist to translate some of the things that we know and understand about our engagement with interfaces, but are not always able to fully articulate. So to conclude, I began by asking, how can visual and digital art practices illuminate the invisibility or the darkness of persuasive design? To contextualize my answers, I argued that recent digital art practices have illuminated the optics of interfaces, and that digital art is increasingly grappling with the affectivity of our highly technologized world. I shared a set of quotes that were generated by an audience in response to an exhibition that addressed persuasive design. And I argued that patterns in the quotations regarding the seduction and repulsion of surfaces can be understood as reflections on interfaces, expressed through the audience's experience of the work. And I want to emphasize in my final words how this process of translation and movement of affect is a product of the work of the artist, in this case, Catriona Beals, who is able to capture ways of thinking and knowing interfaces that might not be immediately apparent in our everyday experiences through material form, through glass, through velvet, and through the emotional work that she puts into the making of her exhibition. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.